That was perfect. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I picked the word pharmacoepidemiology because it's the longest word I could find. My slides are up, brilliant. So it's a real pleasure to be here, talk about one of my favorite subjects, the gut microbiome. But I'm going to give you an insight into other work that my group has been involved with. So my title is From the MS Prodrome to Poop and Beyond. And yes, I'm based in Vancouver, University of British Columbia. So here's a picture of my commute to work. Of course, it never rains, always looks like this. So I know you've heard a lot about this. You've heard about this this morning from the. Is that okay? Is that good? From the MS Society presentation from Helen this morning, which was great. But I'm going to give you the viewpoint from a researcher about how the MS Society funding really places Canada at the forefront of MS research. A little bit closer to the microphone. Wave at me if the sound's not good. I will move. Okay, now you can hear me. Bad luck. So, and I am going to show you, I'm afraid, pictures of British Columbia because it is a lovely place to live. So, and one of my themes is I'm going to show you how the MS Society really does invest in cutting-edge research, paving the way forward to improving outcomes and making a difference in MS. So, I'm going to give you some findings from my group. So I'm going to show you how we've been involved in looking at the MS Prodrome, and I will tell you and define what that is in a moment. And I'm really interested as to what you think about the MS Prodrome. We'll get there in a moment. And yes, I will be talking about poop, the gut microbiome. So I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch because we're going there next. And then I'll just briefly finish up with a summary of some of the studies my group has published in the previous years. And that will just be a couple of slides at the very end showing you what we've done and where we're going. So I would give you an overview of how the MS Society really does place Canada at the forefront of MS research and what it means to a researcher and the team to be get funding from the MS Society of Canada. The Sunshine Coast, this is a fabulous camping spot if anyone's interested. So I just came to Canada for 1 year, 20 years ago now, funded by, and I never left, I'll never leave, funded by the MS Society of Canada. They funded me as a postdoctoral researcher for 1 year. So 20 years later, now I have my own group, and there's a picture of my group from a few years ago now, but I have my own team of really bright, smart, young men and women who are devoting their careers to solving this puzzle of MS. And that is really thanks to the MS Society of Canada. And I like this picture because I don't know if any of you recognize Dr. Charity Evans, and she is now a faculty member back here. She was a postdoc with my group. We loved working with her. And she came back here, and now she's developed her own team of researchers who are all, again, focused on multiple sclerosis. And she was funded by the MS Society of Canada as a postdoc with my team. As researchers, we really try hard to make donor dollars go further. It means a lot to us. And I've worked out that for every $10 the MS Society has given me for research, I leverage that to bring in other money, almost $100 additional research dollars. So my team gets a lot of funding from bodies such as the US National MS Society, because Canada is a very cool place to do research, and I'll show you why in a moment. The UK MS Trust. I'm now funded by the Canadian Research Chair Programme and CIHR and others. So back to my overview slide. We've knocked down the first two pieces. Now we're going to talk about the Prodrome. So in case some of you are thinking, excuse me, what is a Prodrome? Anyone thinking that? Okay. So I'll give you, what I'm going to do now, I'll give you a dictionary definition, but I actually want to ask you what you think about the prodrome. So let's go for the definition. So a prodrome is an early symptom indicating the onset of disease or illness. So prodromal periods have been recognized in other neurological conditions such as Parkinson's disease and, of course, Alzheimer's. And it's been really insightful in these other diseases because they've realized, for example, with Parkinson's, that it probably starts maybe even a decade before classical symptoms of Parkinson's present. And they've also realized that when they look at this prodrome in Parkinson's, they can pick up symptoms that they never thought were going to be related to Parkinson's disease. And it's actually led the whole Parkinson's disease field into looking at whether the gut can be an origin of, or one of the origins or triggers or facilitators of Parkinson's disease. And people would never have thought of that previously. So understanding the symptoms and the signs of the MS prodrome could be really insightful. So in context of MS, I'm talking about symptoms that occurred before our classical understanding of MS symptom onset. Maybe if I can phrase this in another way, when you go get your you get your diagnosis, for example, with multiple sclerosis, you probably had that conversation with your neurologist where he or she asked you to look back over your history and figure out what symptoms you had and when your MS started, and we call that date MS symptom onset. Does that make sense? I'm talking about the time before MS symptom onset. So I want to know, and hopefully that's clear now, maybe I'll say it again, I'm looking at the years, or I'm thinking about symptoms that you may have experienced before MS symptom onset that in hindsight you think were probably related to your MS. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm getting some nods. So I'm curious, anyone, any thoughts? You know, did you personally think, yeah, maybe I did have a prodromal phase where I had symptoms, signs, experiences, which in hindsight now I think probably were related to my MS, but they may have occurred months or years before my official MS symptom onset date. Hope that makes sense. So anyone, any thoughts? Shout a few out if you got a loud voice.
Balance issues.
Okay, balance issues. Yep. Fatigue. Oh, a bit louder. Heat intolerance. Leg pain. So pain. So this is all before MS symptom onset. I'm not just talking about before diagnosis of MS, but before your official MS symptom onset date. Hope that doesn't sound a bit too quirky. Okay, so I think we're all on the same page. It's definitely an area of interest. So when we started this study a few years ago, we were getting some trouble getting funding, and some of the reviewers were saying, well, you're not going to find anything. Yet when I spoke to people with multiple sclerosis and explained to them what we thought a prodrome was, they all had a story to tell. So I'm thinking, you know, there's got to be something here. Why are we not getting believed? And it was quite interesting that I did go back and pick up one of the lead MS medical textbooks from a few years back now. So this was McAlpine's Multiple Sclerosis from which was valid until 2000. So now this is a multiple choice question for you guys. What do you think this lead MS medical textbook said about the MS prodrome? Do you think A, they said, yep, there's a prodrome, B, maybe, but we need more evidence, or C, no? Got some C's, got some B's, we got an A. I've kind of like primed you a bit for this, haven't I? So first up, I was actually surprised they even mentioned the prodrome. But when I actually got to that chapter, they flat out said, no, it didn't exist. There wasn't one in multiple sclerosis, which then made me realize why perhaps it was so challenging us to get the funding to do our study. But nonetheless, we pursued and we got the funding. So now a question to you guys, because this is what we do every day at work. Okay, so I think this thing exists, and I talk to people and they'll tell me their story of the symptoms they were experiencing. But you've got to measure this thing that you think exists in a very, very convincing way. How would you go about that? How would you do that? And I'm asking you because this is what, as researchers, we have to think about these things every day. I have this cool question. So how am I going to do this in a scientifically valid way that people are going to believe? I had timeline. This is quite a big question, isn't it? So, check medical records. I like that answer. Can I move on? You are on the right track. So what we did, and this is why it's so cool to be in Canada. Sorry, this is my analogy. It's kind of like, the world is flat and you've got to convince people that it's not flat. So sometimes I felt this is the challenge we were up against. But exactly as the lady here said, we went to health records and specifically, we call it health administrative information. So what we did, and this is what you can do in Canada, you can go through a very rigorous process and you complete a lot of privacy and ethical pieces, and quite rightly so. We can, after some time, get approval to access health administrative data, and this is where we can access every single prescription filled by individuals, every hospitalization and the reason why, every physician visit and the reason why. And these information are linked together and they're given to us in an anonymized, de-identified form. So we're not obviously allowed to know who the person is or huge amounts of detail on them, but we can get this health information. And we can get this health information that was collected before people develop multiple sclerosis. And if this slide is kind of not meaning much to you, the main thing really you've got to think is that health data in Canada really is amazing. And that's why people like the US will fund our work in Canada well, because they can't do these studies in the US because of their fragmented health system. Hope no one's from the US here. Didn't mean to offend you. So we linked together this data, and we did this in 4 provinces across Canada. And yes, Saskatchewan is in this study, and we work with Charity Evans on this. So we found that 5 years before people developed the first symptoms of MS, we found that they were more likely to access the health system compared to similar people, similar age, sex, who were alive at the same time, who did not develop MS in the general population. So people were more likely to go to a pharmacy to fill a prescription, to visit a hospital, to visit a physician. So interesting. Okay, so we could now show that this prodrome existed, or at least we can see it happening in the health system. So, of course, our next big question is why? What were these people doing? Or, sorry, what health services were these people accessing? What kind of prescriptions were they filling? Why were they visiting the hospital? Why were they visiting a physician? So I've kind of asked you guys already. You've obviously given me thoughts on the prodrome and what it meant to you. So I'm curious, what do you think we found here? Anyone, any thoughts? What do we find here as part of the prodrome? And I heard fatigue before, I heard pain, heard balance issues. Anyone, any other thoughts? Infections, depression, so yeah, mood related. Oh, I didn't hear that. Loss of central vision. So visual issues. So I will share with you some of our findings, and I would say that you guys are correct, because everything pretty much you've said we could observe. So this is 5 years before MS symptom onset. 5 years, we found that people were more likely to present with a physician or fill a prescription for bladder-related issues. And this picture here, sorry, this does make me laugh. This is actually a real picture on a toilet door I found on Cortes Island, which is one of the Gulf Islands. And this kind of described how I felt at that moment in time. But yeah, that is real. More likely to be diagnosed with anxiety or depression, more likely to fill a prescription for an antidepressant, 50% more visits to psychiatrists. And again, this is in the 5 years before MS symptom onset compared to age and sex-matched general population controls. And there is more to unpack here, so I'm going to share a few more findings with you. This work is all published. We've published it over the last 2 years. So 5 years before MS symptom onset, people who were developing MS were more likely to access the health system for pain, we heard that earlier, fibromyalgia, headache and migraine, irritable bowel syndrome, sleep disturbances. And this was a quirky one, actually. We were not expecting this. More visits to a dermatologist, so for skin-related issues. And interestingly, this is the one feature that differentiated in our study people who went on to develop primary progressive MS versus relapsing onset MS. So the majority of people will develop relapsing onset MS, and about 5%, maybe 10, 5% will develop primary progressive MS. And we found that didn't matter what the disease course was, relapsing onset MS, relapsing remitting MS, or primary progressive, we could measure a prodrome, but only the people with relapsing remitting or relapsing onset MS had these visits to the dermatologist. And we scratched our heads thinking, well, maybe it's just a chance finding, because that can happen in research. Maybe it is. But it's interesting, when you go to the literature, you can see that it may be related perhaps to the inflammatory processes in MS, which may actually manifest or present as skin-related issues. Maybe. This needs to be validated, but I find that really intriguing. We weren't expecting that. So some of you may be thinking, okay, this is interesting. Oh, I hope you're thinking it's interesting. But so what? Okay, so what? What can you do with this? So I will just give you my take-home messages. So remind you what we found. We found that the MS prodrome is measurable. It does exist, and it's measurable as a higher healthcare use 5 years before clinical recognition of MS. And it manifests in all these different ways, and that's pain and irritable bowel syndrome and anxiety and depression. So I think it suggests two things. So I think firstly, it suggests that there may be an earlier window of opportunity where we could actually identify MS sooner than we do now. And possibly, if we had drugs that really benefited, for example, long-term outcomes in MS when you give it very, very early, maybe we could then manage MS more effectively. It doesn't have to be drugs, any kind of intervention. So it suggests that, but that's a big ask. We have a long way before we know what to do with this information in order to actually facilitate the earlier recognition and earlier diagnosis of MS. So that's a big, lofty goal. But for me as a researcher, it tells me something right now, and we've changed how we think about MS and how we look at these things. You need to be really careful, or I need to be really careful. If I want to know, or we want to know, what causes multiple sclerosis, we really need to think carefully about this prodromal period. And by that I mean, it's no good me now going, okay, what causes MS? Oh, well, I'll just look at what happened to someone a year or two before MS symptom onset. No, I need to go back further in time, because there's a possibility that people even 5 years before MS symptom onset already have developed MS. We just don't know it yet. Does that make sense? So it really changes how I think about what might cause MS and how we go about looking for that. So it's nice for us as researchers to be able to do something right now with our findings while we're thinking about this loftier goal of how we could package these things up to identify and manage MS earlier. So I just want to point out that these are really smart individuals that drive this research, and this is Jose and Tanya, who were both PhD students or postdocs in my group, who really led this research. So I just want to acknowledge them. So back to my outline slide, and back to everyone's favorite topic, poop. So my question here is, what has poop got to do with multiple sclerosis? And I'm going to talk about the gut microbiome in children with MS. But I just want to check, is this completely news to someone? Has anyone not heard of the microbiome? I just want to know where everyone's at. Don't be shy, okay? Okay. So there is quite a lot in the media these days about the gut microbiome, but I will totally be defining it for you. So I hope you're thrilled to realize that poop is cool, and we have been collecting it and studying it in MS, and I'll be all asking you for samples before you leave. I'm kidding. Okay, so what the heck is the microbiome? So I'm so excited to break this to you, to some of you who didn't realize this before, because you are going to leave here a changed person. So your microbiome are basically all the microbes or bugs that live in or on you. Oh yes, you are coated, inside and out. So did you know? You have trillions of friendly microbes or bugs that live in and on you. In fact, if you like counting cells, you're actually only half human. So half of your cells are human and the other half are microbes. And most of them, over 90% of them, are sitting in your gut, doing a lot of cool things for you. We could not function without our microbiomes in a healthy manner. So I'm just going to share with you some, I think, just interesting stories about how cool the microbiome is. Okay, it's not specific to MS, but just get you thinking about the microbiome. So why am I showing you a plate of sushi? Because when they first started sequencing the microbiome, not that many years ago now, when it became affordable to do it, they realized that people in Japan had a specific microbe which had been borrowed from the oceans. So this microbe normally was in the sea, but it was in the guts of people in Japan. Why was that the case? And they realized that over the millennia, people in Japan, because their diet was heavy in seaweed, at some point they had acquired this microbe which helped them digest their diet, so helped them digest seaweed. And a lot of people in North America don't have this microbe, although they've sequenced now other communities, say in Wales, where they will eat seaweed-based products, and they can find that microbe in their gut as well. Isn't that cool? So microbes will take up residence in you because they know that you're going to feed them well, and you're going to feed them with their favorite food, which in this case was seaweed. Isn't that amazing? Why am I showing you pictures of elephants and this cute little baby elephant? Because they realized that baby elephants eat the feces of the herd, so that the baby elephants can seed their guts with the microbes or the microbiome that the herd has, and it enables the baby elephant to digest whatever diet that herd is eating. Isn't that cool? Now, don't do that at home. We get our microbes in slightly different ways. Let's just leave it at that. But isn't that fascinating? Now, so why else, though? Yeah, no, so what? Why are we interested in this in the context of multiple sclerosis? Well, I find these things really interesting to think about. So Over 90% of serotonin is produced in your gut. We used to think that was just really in the central nervous system, and it's associated with mood and so on. 90% of it is produced in your gut. Your gut microbiome also is important for vitamin production. So vitamin K, you can't produce as a human yourself. It can be challenging to get from the diet, but your gut microbiome can produce vitamins and vitamin K. Really importantly, your gut microbiome regulates your immune system, so your defense system, your defense against infections and other things. So your gut microbiome is constantly in communication with your immune system. Your immune system is constantly checking out what the gut microbiome is doing. There's that two-way communication. And we think this may be really important in context of multiple sclerosis. Now, you guys all know that there is a gut-brain connection. You've all felt that feeling in the bottom of your stomach when something bad or good has just happened, right? Do you feel that butterfly kind of feeling? Well, that's your gut and your brain talking to each other. You actually have a vagus nerve, this wandering nerve that goes directly from your gut to your brain. So your gut and brain can communicate directly, but also indirectly as well, through the immune system, which then will wander up to the brain. Your gut microbiome will break down your food and produce these little packages, metabolites, these packages which are going to go up to your brain. So there's constant communication. So you can see now why we're really interested in the gut microbiome and MS. Is that becoming clear? So it's a huge area of interest. All right, so I said I'd talk about gut microbiome in children with multiple sclerosis. Now, fortunately, MS in kids is very, very rare, but for the research perspective, it can be a unique opportunity to explore what might cause MS and to look at disease outcomes in MS, such as relapses, because kids have done fewer things compared to adults. So it's not to say that studying kids is easy, but it can be somewhat easier to uncover what might have caused or MS or what might drive MS. So as you can imagine, the typical adult might, say, present with multiple sclerosis, let's just say in their 30s. Well, if you want to know what causes MS, it's really hard to say to someone, so tell me what you did for the last 30 years. What did you eat 10 years ago? Where? So you get the idea. That's really hard. We can't remember back that well. But for kids, it can be somewhat easier to get that kind of information. Often the parents will know when they were, vaccinated or whatever, and so on and so forth. So you can get that history, which is really important when we're thinking about what causes MS. So pediatric MS, though, is very challenging to study because it is so rare, fortunately. We think that about maybe less than 5% of people with MS will develop symptoms in childhood, and by that I mean before age 18. So I was lucky enough to go down to San Francisco, where Dr. Emmanuel Wauborn had been collecting stool samples from kids with MS and kids without multiple sclerosis. And I was lucky enough to go down and look at those samples. So, by the way, I didn't actually look at the poop. Someone else did all that. I just get the data, so I get the information on what microbes are sitting there, and I get to analyze that information. So I want to ask you, what do you think we found? So, multiple choice question. Does the gut microbiome or the gut microbiota, it's okay to use the words interchangeably, does the gut microbiota composition differ between the children with MS compared to the children without? So again, we're looking at stool samples, and we've sequenced those stool samples to look at what microbes are there. So do you think we found a difference? Are you a yes? Are you a no? Are you a no idea? Don't care? Why are you standing here if you didn't find anything? Anyone want to say anything else? I heard a lot of yeses. So I'm being really mean because it was kind of yes and no. Okay, it depends how you measure the gut microbiota, and I was mean because I know I didn't tell you that. So the answer was yes and no. Okay, so what do I mean by yes and no? So what did we find in children with multiple sclerosis? So we found that the gut microbiome of children with MS was largely similar to children without MS. So I am going to use an analogy of a garden. So I hope this makes sense. Can you imagine your gut microbiome is like a flourishing ecosystem? You've got tons of microbes in there. And so if you could imagine your gut microbiome is an ecosystem, it's a garden. We did not find this. We did not find that the kids with MS had some kind of devastated gut microbiome that looked horrendous. No, we did not find that. And that the controls looked like, look magic. No. Kind of looked more like this, that they both had pretty good-looking microbiomes, or at least they were pretty diverse, and they largely were not that different. But when we looked up close, we could see differences for individual groups of microbes or individual bugs. And I'm back to my garden analogy. It's almost as if when we looked up close, we could kind of see more weeds growing in the gut microbiomes or in the gardens of the kids with MS. So we could find more bugs that kind of are associated with inflammation and inflammatory processes. We could see that more often in the kids with multiple sclerosis compared to the kids without. So I hope that makes sense. Big caveat, this study was very small. So we had 38 children. Pediatric MS is rare. But I'm thrilled to say that we've got additional funding from the MS Society, who were intrigued by our pilot level findings here. And we are just finishing up sequencing a much larger group of individuals. We have stool samples from children with MS and children without, and we're really hopeful it can give us a greater understanding of what these differences mean. And this is a collaboration between Canada and the US. So we had a second question, though, we wanted to ask of this small group of children that we had. And this was our second question. Is the gut microbiota associated with future relapse risk? So we had stool samples on these kids with MS now, just in that group, and we followed them forward in time to see when they had their first on-study relapse or MS attack. So I'll just cut to the chase and say preliminary evidence suggests that there is an association, or we found an association in our small study. So we found that depletion or absence of a specific group of microbes. Now, the name is really not that important. So I know I've written it up here, Fusobacteria, but the name itself is really not that important. And I'll say why in a moment. But we found that depletion of a specific group of microbes in the guts of children with MS was associated with an earlier risk of relapse. Now, if you like your Kaplan-Meier curves, which I do, I'm going to show you how to interpret one. So here we have time along the bottom, and at time 0, which is when we got the stool sample, none of our patients have had a relapse at time 0, because that's when we start the clock. And we follow them forward, and in the ideal world, no child would have an MS relapse. These are all kids with MS, and the line would be, ideal world, it'd be flat up here. So those who had this Fusobacteria were at a lower risk of a relapse, and those who didn't have it were at a higher risk of an earlier relapse. So interesting, hey? Now, why I say the name Fusobacteria is not important, because we need to validate these findings. This is just one study, and it's very small, and we need to validate these findings and show that it's really true. So it's a little bit too early to break open the fireworks and celebrate. So we're trying hard now to validate this finding, but it's given us a real, and to figure out as well what these fusobacteria, if we can validate this, what the heck they're doing. Because a name is interesting, but it's what they're doing that's important. So we're looking into this in greater detail at the moment. And hopefully I'll be back in a couple of years to share you those findings. Okay, this is just a fun facts interlude. Multiple choice, but this is just silly. So part of our gut microbiome study, we had kids, or parents probably, mailing us, oh yes, this went Canada Post. Bad luck, mail people. We had them mailing us their stool samples on ice. We don't need much stool, it was just a small little amount. And kids from Saskatchewan were involved as well. So where do you think they mailed their poop to? I'll tell you what, it's brilliant, because if you want to get something out of your mail system at the hospital quickly, it can be a nightmare. They'll sit on it forever. If you tell them there's feces coming in, you get it really quickly. That mailroom does not want to be sitting on a package of poop for a week or two. I learned that. It was a lot of fun. So where were they? Where have we been? Where have their poops been sent to? Toronto? Who's a Toronto fan or not fan? Do we send feces to Regina? Winnipeg? Or you don't care? What do you think? Toronto? We don't like Toronto. We'll send you poop. It went to Winnipeg. Sorry, I told you that was just a silly interlude. But then we had a biobank there. There's the National Microbiology Lab that was sequencing our samples. So there you go. It didn't go to Regina. It went to Winnipeg. Okay, so I am going to finish up now. 2 more slides, I believe, with content on. I'm going to share with you some of my team's recent publications or findings that I think you might find interesting, just to give you an insight what my group does. So, interesting question we had a few years back. What is the cancer risk in MS? So I thought you might be quite interested to know, this is published, that cancer risk is actually lower than you would expect. So people with MS are at a lower risk of cancer. Now, I want to emphasize, it does not mean you cannot get cancer. Absolutely does not mean that. It just means that your overall risk does seem to be lower. And it's not just us in British Columbia that found that. Other studies in other countries have also found that. So it does not mean that you cannot develop cancer. It does not mean that. You obviously still must go to the usual cancer screening programs, but it does seem that the risk is somewhat lower in the MS population. So that's kind of a interesting good news story to share with you. Of course, our next question was, well, the things like the drugs for multiple sclerosis, did they alter cancer risk? And here we were able to just look at one group of drugs, just one group, the beta interferons. And we were able to show, to our relief, that we could not find any evidence that exposure to the beta interferons, a disease-modifying drug for MS, we did not find evidence that it altered cancer risk. And this was over 12 years of follow-up, which is a decent length of time. And we're hoping we can roll this out now to look at some of the newer drugs for multiple sclerosis. So I do have a large drug safety and effectiveness program funded by CHR, and we are really interested in trying to prevent side effects to the MS drugs. So we published this in Nature Genetics last year, and I'm really excited. We found that a genetic marker in saliva could actually help us differentiate or identify who was at risk of developing a certain side effect to an MS drug. And here it was specifically liver injury and beta interferon. But this is my dream, right? This is my dream, that one day you'll walk into your doctor's office, you'll spit into a tube, you'll hand over some of your poop, and your physician can sequence that immediately and then come back to you and say, we've looked at your profile and we think that you maybe want to consider this drug and this drug and this drug, but maybe not that one because you're at a higher risk of developing this side effect, or you may not tolerate it as well. Wouldn't that be cool? Okay, we're not there yet, but this is my dream. So saliva and poop is going to answer everything. How does MS impact life expectancy? This has really shaped how my group thinks. We found that life expectancy has increased in MS over the years at a similar rate to life expectancy being increased in the general population. But it's made us really realize how we need to focus on healthy aging in MS, and you heard about that from Dr. Catherine Knox this morning. Okay, so what next? This is my last slide. So what is my team involved with at the moment? Of course, we're looking at the gut microbiome in children and youth with multiple sclerosis, and I hope to come back and share some findings with you. We've got a study funded by CIHR looking at the disease-modifying drugs for multiple sclerosis and safety and long-term effectiveness, and that involves 5 Canadian provinces, including Saskatchewan, with Dr. Charity Evans. So that's a very interesting study. We're looking at the risk of cardiovascular disease in MS and how it might impact MS and outcomes in MS. And this is a kind of maybe a quirky one, but it's I'm interested to what we'll find. We're looking at the risk of MS in a population that's already living with a chronic infection. So we're looking at the risk of MS in the HIV population, and this is a collaboration with Sweden. And we're looking at whether there's a role of the antiretroviral drugs. So we're hopeful we can show something here. We believe that the risk of MS is actually very low in the HIV population, but we want to see if that's true and if it's somehow related to the antiretroviral drugs, and if that can tell us something about MS and give us insights maybe on how we can treat or maybe even prevent MS in the future. That's a very interesting study, and there's more. I am finishing up right now, but I'm going to put this one out here because I quite often get asked this question. I am not a nutritionalist or a dietitian, but a lot of people want to know what's the best diet for my MS or for my gut microbiome. So drum roll, please. I will share with you the best evidence to date, and it's Follow the Canada's Food Guide, which was actually just updated this year. This is the best evidence for healthy living. As you probably are aware, there's a lot of interest in diet in MS, and I'm afraid there's nothing specific that we can say absolutely works, but people are working on this hard. Not my team, but other people are. But it's interesting if you think about the Canada Food Guide, half your plate fruit and vegetables, that if everyone actually followed this diet, it would be incredibly radical because most of us don't. So if you want to do something really radical for yourself, follow the Canada Food Guide. Okay, so I'm just going to say thank you very much. I'm just acknowledging past and present members of my group and my funding bodies and key Canadian collaborators, and of course Charity Evans here in Saskatchewan and others. I'm going to leave you with some pictures of British Columbia. This is Garibaldi Lakes, just an hour and a half outside of Vancouver, and I'm really happy to take questions. Just don't ask me what she's doing. I don't know. Thank you very much for your attention. Really appreciated. And I'll be hanging around this afternoon if people want to come and ask me more. So no need to be shy. A question. I think there's a roving. Oh, there's a microphone coming. So do raise your hand. Thank you.
I would just like to hear your thoughts about the H1N1 virus and MS. Is there a connection?
Also, in short, no. That I'm aware of. I'm not aware of any evidence. Are you thinking in terms of potentially triggering multiple sclerosis? No, I'm not aware of any direct evidence. The most evidence there is in terms of viruses that might be associated with MS probably really is for Epstein-Barr virus. So we know that people, for example, who present with mononucleosis, which is if you get Epstein-Barr virus later in life, in your teenage years, you can sometimes present with mono. I think in the UK it's called kissing disease, but I think here it's called mono. that is associated with a higher risk of future development of multiple sclerosis. It's interesting, though, because even in the scientific community, people still argue back and forth if it really causes MS or if it's just kind of on the pathway to developing MS. How can I put that another way? It's just a bystander. You would have had that anyway. Because your immune system is somehow different, you're actually more likely to present with mono, but it never actually caused your MS. But there is pretty compelling evidence that it's really hard to find someone who has MS who is not positive to Epstein-Barr virus. So Epstein-Barr virus, 99% of us in this room have Epstein-Barr virus. You get it when your granny kisses you when you're like 2 years old, or that's how you're meant to get it. You know, we're meant to co-evolve with Epstein-Barr virus, or at least that's my viewpoint on it anyway. And the theory is that if you get delayed exposure to Epstein-Barr virus, then maybe that could increase your risk of developing MS. That's the virus with the best evidence.
So, to the best of your knowledge, has there been any research regarding the H1N1 and MS?
I don't think so. I mean, Scott, can you help me out? Sorry, Dr. Patton, can you help me out here? I'm not aware of anything. No. And there's the usual advice. I know this isn't your question, but go get your flu vaccine. I mean, but that's nothing to do with, you know, what causes MS, but good advice, go get your flu vaccine. But thanks for your question.
Another question here.
So I have a 16-year-old son who's autistic, and in the autism community, it's all about the poop as well. So I'm wondering, when you have those microbiome, or when you do those studies and you end up with the data from that, does that get shared between the different research groups, or is that something that you kind of have to ask for, or like, is there a collaborative aspect to that?
In the context of our study, yes, I would love people to access this data. So we're going to have so much information. I'm always talking to other research groups to see if they want to come in with additional questions they could ask of this information. Obviously, it all has to get, ethical approval and go through all the privacy regulations. But just talking in the bigger arena, in terms of the gut microbiome and people sharing findings, absolutely. There's a lot of, they call them citizen science projects. So there's the huge gut microbiome, the American gut it's called, the Gut Microbiome Project in the US. And I'm really excited to say that not me, but the wider community have just initiated the Canadian gut. And so how it works, my team were involved actually, and we sent some of our own samples down to the US to be sequenced. But how it works with the American gut is that you pay your $99 or whatever it is, and you send them your stool sample and they sequence it, and they'll give you back your information, but you consent for your information to be added to their database. So when you get your data back, you get compared to everyone else in the database. So you can compare how your gut microbiome looks to theirs. Now, just health warning or whatever, you can't really do anything with this information. It's just kind of like, oh, that's interesting, but you can't actually rush out and do something different to then, with that information. It's just more of, at the moment, it's an academic endeavor, but we hope obviously something meaningful will end up with it. So does that make sense? You can Google American gut, you can go online, and we're hoping there'll be a Canadian gut soon as well. We're just collecting samples right now. It's a question at the back, and so I'm not in the...
Okay, I'll ask mine. So my husband has MS, and we have 3 children, 4 grandchildren. And I can see some of these prodromes that you're identifying might be emerging with some of our adult children now. Is there something that our kids who are in their 30s and 40s could be considering, or should they just keep living their lives? Just as an example, our daughter has had mono. She's got a lot of fatigue right now. No one's saying she might have MS, but my husband does.
So I think you bring up some really interesting issues. So first up, I would say, remember, and this is why I said the Prodrome is so challenging, a lot of those symptoms are very fuzzy, generic. A lot of us will get fatigue, and you're not going to develop MS. So a lot of us will get those symptoms, and it has nothing to do with MS. So that's why I'm saying it's a really lofty goal for us to figure out how we can package these things together in a meaningful way to identify people earlier. And obviously, if you have mono, it does not mean you're going to develop MS. There are many, 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 many people who have mono do not develop MS. I mean, obviously, usual advice, if you're concerned, you could go see your neurologist or your physician. I'm not a physician, so I'm not obviously going to give any clinical advice or anything. People are interested in trying to reduce people's risk of MS, but interested, I'm not saying this would necessarily make a difference, by things such as vitamin D. Okay, so you could take vitamin D supplements, maybe go out in the sun and sun exposure. But again, visit a physician and talk it through. So I know that's not very specific, but yeah, live a healthy life. Follow the Canada Food Guide. You're going to hate me for saying that.
Another question here.
I have a question. What's your opinion on plexus? I mean, you hear this all the time. I'm not sure. I may be exaggerating, but it's the magic stuff to take and everything will be fine.
I don't know what you mean by plexus. Sorry. Can you...
I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't myself. I'm not into that stuff. There may be somebody here that knows something about it, but I mean, it has to do with here maybe.
It's something that's supposed to work with your gut.
Oh, you're
stuff.
not thinking like probiotics.
Yeah, probiotics.
Okay,
is another part
probiotics,
of it.
prebiotics. So probiotics, yep, you can walk down to the supermarket right now and you will be, there is a wall full of probiotics. There is nothing specific in MS that I could say that would be of value. Actually, it's a bigger... The whole regulation issue in probiotics is actually really interesting. And as someone phrased it once, it's like the Wild West out there. If you want to start a probiotic brand, you can go out tomorrow, develop one, as long as you can show it's it's safe for human use, meaning that it's been consumed by humans previously. So get a probiotic that exists in yogurt or something. You can package it up and call it your magic probiotic. You're allowed to do that. You could go do that tomorrow. There's a lot of not good regulation in terms of the quality of the products and how many microbes are actually living in those products. So there's no evidence that they will have any benefit in MS at the moment as it stands. I understand that some people are trying to get official FDA approval or Health Canada approval for a specific probiotic to treat a certain condition, but no probiotic has been licensed or approved for that. So none of them have gone through a particularly rigorous process either. Best case scenario, you'd do yourself no harm, but you'd burn a hole in your pocket because they're quite expensive.
I guess I actually have two questions. The first is with that study that you did, any of those children, would they have had parents with MS?
It was actually it's an exclusion. It's a good question. It's an exclusion criteria. So we didn't want any kids with a family member with MS. So short answer is no. But it would be really interesting if you could get gut microbiome from family members and having a look at that connection. That would obviously be a huge study, and particularly in pediatric MS, we would need thousands upon thousands upon thousands of families in order to find that. So it's an interesting question. Yeah.
And I guess my second question, is there any research into people with MS, their children, looking in terms of the prodromal? I
spent my summer writing that grant. So I hope I'm going to get funding to do that, to look at the prodrome in kids, because you'd think that if you could find it in kids, that would really get you closer to this real MS prodrome. You probably heard from some of the symptoms that people are calling out earlier. Some of those symptoms probably were just misdiagnoses of MS. So what we really want to know is what's this true prodrome, really things that we never knew were connected with MS that we're picking up, like the skin-related piece, is that true? I hope we get funding. I won't know till next year. Getting funding is a long process.
Hi, this question is in relation to the depression and anxiety piece that you mentioned. I have several friends who went through very traumatic events prior to their diagnosis. It could be divorce, it could be death in the family. Have you found any information in any of that in that piece that seems clear?
So I'm guessing your question is now related to, could major stress cause multiple sclerosis? I kind of want to know what Dr. Scott Patton thinks as well, because I'm sure you've looked at this area. So I would first up say, measuring stress, psychological stress, whatever, is very difficult. One person's stress can be good, right? Because stress can kind of make you get up in the morning and do things. Too much stress can be overwhelming, and how you respond to that stress can be overwhelming. There was only one study that I can remember off the top of my head, because a lot of them are negative. A lot of them cannot find an association between stress and the risk of developing multiple sclerosis. Possibly, I'm not saying probably, could be in part because it's so difficult to measure stress. There was one study I can think of out of Denmark, and they looked at actually, they said, okay, what is a stressful thing that could happen to someone that no one would say, oh, that's not really that stressful? And they actually looked at a death of a child. So they looked at parents or mothers whose child had died, right? No one would say that's not stressful. That is hugely stressful. And they could show that there seemed to be a slight increased risk of developing MS earlier in those mothers. The researchers couldn't conclude that stressful episode caused MS, but they thought that the information showed that the MS occurred earlier than it would have before. That's the only study I can think of off the top of my head. It's so hard measuring stress. So the question is it a contributing factor rather than a cause? It could be. Yeah, I don't know. I think, measuring stress is hard, and then resilience is probably important as well. So we can all have a similar stress, and some of us would have a meltdown, and other people would, go through that fine. I'm sure resilience has got something to do with it as well. So, yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's 2:00. I should move on. I'll be here if anyone wants to ask any more questions. Really appreciate it.